The Texas sun showed no mercy. It beat down on the livestock market until the red dirt turned into choking clouds of dust, wrapping itself around boots, coats, and even the sweat-streaked faces of tired men. It was the summer of 1887 in the town of Redemption Creek, and the monthly cattle auction had filled the streets with noise and sweat. Horses neighed, cattle bellowed, and the calls of ranchers rose above it all, bargaining over beef and bone as if the animals were nothing more than coins with hides. Jonathan Hale stood apart from the bustle, leaning against the rail of a pen. At 35, he was tall and lean, his shoulders broad from years of roping, mending, and breaking horses. His gray eyes, storm-dark and watchful, studied every movement of the stock. He'd come for a new mare, something strong to replace Duchess, his old horse who'd laid down last winter and never rose again. But fate has a way of steering men where they don't expect to go. At the far end of the market, near the shade of crooked stalls, a crowd had gathered. It wasn't the usual kind of excitement, the buzz over a prime bull or a wild stallion brought in from the hills. This was something else. The air around that knot of men was sharp, uneasy, the kind that made Jonathan's neck prickle. He moved closer, strong enough for household work. A rough voice was saying, "Don't let her looks fool you. She can cook, clean, tend to animals, can't hear a thing, and don't speak a word." Perfect for a man who values peace and quiet. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He shoved his way through until he could see. There, standing like she'd been thrown in with the cattle, was a girl, no more than 19, though dust and bruises made her seem older. A rope bound her wrists. Her dark hair hung loose and tangled, framing a face marked by a bruise on her cheek. But it wasn't her dirt-streaked dress or the rope that stopped Jonathan. It was her eyes. They were brown, deep and sharp like fresh coffee beans, and in them burned something that didn't match the trader's words. Not weakness, not hopelessness, strength. The kind he'd only ever seen in wild horses that refused to break, no matter how much rope or steel was thrown at them. Here's Clara Rose. The trader went on. Samuel McKenna, Jonathan realized, a man known in these parts for dirty deals, stolen horses, bootleg whiskey, and worse. Her own daddy brought her to me. Said she was nothing but trouble since her mama died. Couldn't contribute, what with being deaf and mute. Figured I'd find some use for her, even if she's damaged goods. The crowd muttered. Some men stepped closer, curious. One man, Benjamin Crawford, a rancher notorious for working his hands near to death, asked, "How much?" $50, McKenna spat. Same as a good pack mule, which is about what she's worth. Jonathan felt his gut twist. Men haggling over a girl like she was no different from the cattle penned beside her. He'd seen cruelty before, too much of it during his years in the Indian Wars, and he'd sworn never again to turn his eyes away when it stared him in the face. He was about to leave when it happened. Clara Rose lifted her head. Just for a moment, her eyes met his across the crowd. It wasn't a plea. It wasn't desperation. It was fire, quiet, controlled, but burning. Before he could think, the words were out of his mouth, "I'll take her." The crowd fell silent, then shifted, whispers buzzing. McKenna's yellow grin split wide Jonathan Hale. "Didn't figure you for the type. Guess even a man holed up on that godforsaken ranch needs company." $50. Cash on the barrel. Quote, Jonathan pulled the roll of bills from his vest. It was nearly all he had, saved for the mare he'd planned to buy. His pride stung as he handed it over, but he couldn't pull back now, not after seeing her eyes. McKenna shoved Clara Rose forward so hard she stumbled. "She's yours now. No returns. Break her. Keep her." The men chuckled, shaking their heads at Jonathan's foolishness. Crawford clapped him on the shoulder with mock sympathy. "Hope she's worth it." Hale Jonathan ignored them. He pulled his knife and cut the rope from Clara Rose's wrists. She flinched, bracing for pain, but he only sheathed the blade again. "Can you walk?" he asked, before realizing how foolish the question was. If she was deaf, she hadn't heard a word, but she looked up, studied his lips, and nodded. Without another word, he turned toward the edge of town where his wagon waited. He didn't check to see if she followed, but he felt her presence close behind him, her steps surprisingly light for someone the trader had called useless. The wagon sat under a scraggly mesquite tree, his team, thunder and lightning, waiting patiently. He checked their water, buying himself a moment to breathe. What in blazes had he just done? He'd come for a horse and was leaving with a young woman. A stranger, deaf and mute if McKenna's word was true. When he turned, she was standing there, watching him with those sharp brown eyes that saw too much. In the sunlight, he noticed the dirt didn't hide her beauty. Her features were fine, her dress faded but once blue, her bare feet cut and calloused from hard ground. He pointed to the wagon bed and then motioned for her to sit. She climbed up with a grace that startled him. She sat, knees pulled tight to her chest, like she was ready to spring if danger came. Jonathan sighed. He had no business taking her in. His ranch was a lonely place, far from town, hard and unforgiving. Yet something about the way she had looked at him in that moment wouldn't let him walk away. He climbed onto the seat, snapping the reins. "It's a long ride," he muttered, though he knew she couldn't hear. "Best get comfortable." The wagon rattled down the dusty trail out of Redemption Creek. Behind him, the girl sat silent, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The storm clouds he'd noticed earlier were thickening, dark and heavy. He thought of the $50 gone, of the horse he didn't buy, of the stranger he had bought instead. But every time he risked a glance back, those eyes met his. Not broken, not pleading, something stronger, something that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Jonathan Hale had no way of knowing it yet, but that moment, one man, one girl, one wagon rolling into the wide Texas wilderness, was the beginning of everything that would change his life forever. The road stretched wide and empty as the wagon creaked under the weight of silence. Jonathan kept his eyes on the trail, but his thoughts were restless. Beside the supplies, Clara Rose sat still, her arms around her knees. She hadn't spoken a sound, hadn't made a single noise since leaving Redemption Creek. Only her eyes moved, studying everything, the sway of the horses, the sky, even him when she thought he wasn't looking. Storm clouds gathered thick and heavy. The air carried that electric weight that warned of trouble. Jonathan knew the signs well. He'd seen enough storms to know this one was riding fast. His horses tossed their heads, sensing it too. He was already scanning the land when a sharp tug on his sleeve startled him. Clara Rose had moved forward on the wagon, her face intent. She pointed toward the southwest, her gestures quick and certain. Jonathan squinted in that direction but saw nothing but dust and sagebrush. "There's nothing there," he muttered before cursing himself. Fool! She couldn't hear him anyway. But she didn't stop. She made shapes with her hands, 2 fingers walking, then diving down like into a ravine. Then she pressed her palm to her chest and pointed again. Her eyes burned with urgency. Jonathan hesitated, but his gut told him to trust her. He snapped the reins, steering the wagon toward the direction she insisted. Within minutes he saw it. A narrow canyon, almost invisible until they were nearly on top of it. A cut in the earth that offered shelter. He guided the horses down the steep path as the storm broke loose across the open plains. Sand whipped the air, turning the sky brown. Inside the canyon, the wind eased. A shallow chamber under an overhang gave them cover. Jonathan jumped down, securing the horses with fast, steady hands. Clara Rose was already gathering supplies before the storm tore them away, moving with sharp efficiency. The storm screamed above them. Sand pounded the canyon walls. Jonathan pulled his bandana up to cover his mouth. Then he noticed Clara Rose had nothing. Without thinking, he stripped off his coat and draped it over her head and shoulders. Her eyes widened, and for a heartbeat they were close enough that he saw flecks of gold in her brown gaze. Then she lowered her face, hiding under the coat as the storm raged. Hours seemed to pass before the wind finally weakened. Dust settled, leaving them coated in red earth. Jonathan straightened and glanced at her. She shook the coat free, then offered it back, but he waved it off. "Keep it. Night will be cold." He set about checking the wagon. Supplies survived. Horses calmer now. He struck a fire from the brush he'd gathered, the orange light flickering against the canyon walls. Clara Rose sat across from him, watching the flames, her knees still pulled tight. Jonathan tried again. He pointed to himself, Jonathan. Quote, he said clearly. Then he pointed at her, lifting his brow. She studied his face, then pointed to herself and mouthed the name, Clara. He nodded. Clara Rose. For the first time, she gave a small smile. She touched her ears, then her throat, then shook her head. You can't hear or speak, Jonathan said slowly, making sure she could see his lips. She nodded, but then she placed her hand flat against the ground. She closed her eyes, then pointed upward toward the horses. Almost at once, thunder shifted his hooves and snorted, followed by lightning. You felt that? Jonathan asked, his voice low with disbelief. She opened her eyes and smiled faintly, tapping the ground again. I hear differently. Her gestures said more than words. That night, he gave her his bedroll. She tried to refuse, but he insisted, settling himself against the canyon wall with only a blanket. As the fire dimmed, he caught her watching him. Then she pressed her hand to her chest, extended it toward him. A simple gesture, but heavy with meaning. Gratitude. Jonathan lay awake for a long time, staring at the canyon's jagged edge against the stars. He had bought her like cattle, but what he had seen today, the way she'd found shelter, the way she moved with quiet strength, told him she was no helpless girl. There was something fierce in her, something untamed, and it unsettled him more than any storm. By morning, they reached the Double H Ranch, his home carved from the valley between two ridges. The adobe house, barn, and corral were plain but solid, built with his own hands. Jonathan gestured broadly, letting her read his lips. This is it. Welcome to the Double H. Quote. Clara Rose's gaze swept the land. When her eyes fell on the horses, her expression softened. She walked to the fence, and Liberty, the bay mare, stepped forward at once, ears pricked, curious. Clara reached out, placed her palm against the mare's neck, and stood still. After a moment, she turned to Jonathan and pointed to Liberty's foreleg. Hurt. Frowning, Jonathan checked. Sure enough, heat and swelling he hadn't noticed. I'll be damned, he muttered. When he looked back at Clara Rose, she was already heading for the barn. Within minutes, she had gathered salve and bandages, mixing herbs with sure hands. She treated the mare with a confidence that silenced Jonathan. When she finally looked up, he realized the truth. McKenna had lied. She wasn't broken, she wasn't useless, she was something else entirely. And Jonathan Hale, a man who thought he'd outlived the chance for change, felt the first crack in the walls he'd built around his solitary heart. Life on the Double H Ranch found a rhythm. Clara Rose rose before dawn, lantern glowing in the barn, her hands already tending the animals before Jonathan even stirred. Chickens that usually scattered around him gathered quietly at her feet. Barn cats, half-wild things, curled in her lap. But it was the horses that proved she had a gift beyond reason. She healed them, calmed them, and understood them in a way Jonathan had never seen. Jonathan taught her his signs for ranch work, and she made her own, building a silent language between them. It wasn't long before he could read her mood in the tilt of her head or the motion of her fingers. One evening, while Jonathan worked on a harness, he heard it, soft humming from the barn. Clara Rose was brushing Liberty, the melody low and sweet. Liberty stood still, eyes half closed in calm. Jonathan froze, stunned. I thought you couldn't speak, he said softly. Clara spun, dropping the brush. Fear flashed across her face. She touched her throat and shook her head, but Jonathan saw the truth in her eyes. Her voice was damaged, not gone. That night, she hid from him, curled in the hayloft. He found her there. Clara Rose, he said gently. I don't care what McKenna said. I don't care what was done to you. You're not broken. Her eyes shone in the lantern light. Slowly, she climbed down, reached for his hand, and pressed it against her throat. Then she tried. A sound rasped out, rough and painful, but It was hers. She signed fiercely, damaged, not whole. Jonathan gripped her hands, number strong, stronger than a Mustang. Her lips parted in surprise, and for the first time, real tears slid down her cheeks. But the world wasn't ready to leave them in peace. One Sunday in town, Clara Rose waited by the church fence as Jonathan loaded supplies. Voices rose. People crowded around her. She makes signs like a witch. Martha Edison cried, "I saw her touch a sick child," and the fever broke by morning. What Christian power is that others joined, fear twisting their words. Someone shouted to drive her out. Jonathan shoved through the mob, standing between Clara Rose and the crowd. "She's no witch," he said, his voice hard. "She's healed your animals, your children. Fear her if you want, but you'll not touch her." But just as the mob surged forward, every horse on Main Street reared, whinnying in unison. Men scrambled, wagons tipped, and chaos scattered the crowd. Jonathan grabbed Clara Rose's hand and ran. They didn't stop until the ranch was in sight. That night, Clara Rose confessed her past through trembling hands. Her mother had the same gift. Branded a witch, her mother was burned, their home destroyed. Her father, poisoned by fear and shame, tried to silence Clara Rose. Failing that, he sold her to McKenna. Jonathan's chest burned with anger at her story, but he held her close. "You're not cursed, you're a blessing. And anyone who says different can answer to me." The following weeks proved him right and wrong. Neighbors began riding past at night, torches burning, silent warnings left in hoof prints. The barn was set ablaze one cold November night, only their frantic work saving the animals. A message burned into the wood: send the witch away or burn with her. Clara Rose tried to leave, believing she had brought ruin. Jonathan refused. "If they come, they'll face me first. You belong here." When the mob finally came, led by Thomas Roosevelt, rifles in hand, Jonathan stood tall at the ranch gate. Miguel Cervantes, Sarah Nightingale, and Dr. Hamilton stood with him, neighbors who Clara Rose had healed, who would not let her face the mob alone. But it was Clara Rose who stepped forward. She stood straight, her hand over her swelling belly. Jonathan hadn't noticed before, but she carried his child now. Her hands moved in broad, sure signs. Dr. Hamilton translated, "You call me witch. You call me cursed. But I am only what God made me. I heal because I feel. I listen because the earth speaks. Fear me if you will, but do not hate me for loving life." Then she hummed that same melody, clear and strong despite her ruined throat. Every horse in sight lowered to its knees. Silence fell over the mob like a blanket. Even Roosevelt's horse bowed, throwing him into the dirt. Gasps rose from the crowd. Fear turned to awe. Jonathan stepped beside her, his arm wrapping around her shoulders. "Sweetheart," he whispered, his voice thick with pride. "You're stronger than a Mustang." She leaned into him, tears glistening in her eyes, but her smile was steady. The mob broke apart. Some fled, others stayed, shame in their faces. But one thing was certain: Clara Rose was no longer just Jonathan's secret. She was a force no one in Redemption Creek could deny. And with a child on the way, their story had only just begun.